In this movie, we are taking one step closer to the process of getting the Visual Basic language launched and getting started writing programs. We will look at the basic steps for writing a Visual Basic project. We will explore the files that make up a Visual Basic project, discuss briefly design time, runtime, and debug time, and look at error types such as syntax errors, runtime errors, and logic errors. And finally, we will look at the steps necessary to launch Visual Basic 2008. When writing a Visual Basic project, there are three basic steps that you want to keep in mind. You first want to design the user interface, which includes any controls needed for the user to interact with. You will then set up the properties for the controls. Important things such as naming the controls and setting text properties and so forth. And finally, you begin to write code, which you will need to pay attention to the language's syntax rules. Syntax rules are rules that must be followed, such as the spelling and punctuation and using of special symbols and certain key words. When you have a Visual Basic application, you will notice that there will be many files that make up even one simple Visual Basic application. The one file that you will want to interact with is called the solution file. You will recognize this because it will have the .sln extension. You will want to avoid opening all other files that are automatically created with each solution. You will want to open and close the solution file only. The executable file is the file that the end user will ultimately run or executes. And much later in this tutorial, we will talk about how to deploy an executable file so the user can run with it. And also will show you exactly where the executable file gets generated. When you're working in the Visual Basic environment, you will want to recognize there are various modes that you will be in. The easy way to determine what mode you're in is to look at the top of the screen while running Visual Basic. It will say either design time, run time, or break time. Design time is when you are designing the user interface and writing code. Nothing is happening in terms of the compiler and is waiting for you to submit a program to it. Runtime is when you're trying to run your program and you're trying to test it to see if it actually works as designed. This is what the user ultimately will see from their perspective. Break time occurs when error or other error condition may occur. When you're in break time, you cannot make any changes to your program. Rather, you must stop the program, return to design time, and then make the necessary changes. Some more terminology are the terms event and procedures. Each user action causes an event to occur. When you write code, you will write code to react to a specific event. Event procedures are considered the code written by the programmer to react to these events. Note that if you ignore certain events, then nothing will happen. So that's perfectly okay. You will have many events that could possibly happen, but unless you write code for those events, nothing will occur during the program. When you have an error, and if it is a syntax error, you must fix this error. This is sometimes called a compile error because it happens when the program is trying to be compiled by the programming language, such as Visual Basic. Visual Basic's editor will detect and correct many errors. A blue squiggly line appears under the code that the editor does not understand. If you move the mouse over this blue squiggly line, you will receive more details. There is also an error list window which will show up at the bottom of the screen that will show more errors and more details for errors. Logic errors are difficult to find because you're not told that the error exists, but it does produce incorrect results. Logic errors are easy to overlook because you may assume that the calculations or the other desired output is correct unless you use good test data to check your results. The Visual Basic editor cannot detect logic errors. You will need to use some debugging tools which we will explore in this course. Finally, you're ready to launch Visual Basic 2008. Assuming it has been installed in your machine, you simply click Start, choose All Programs. You will then find an item called Microsoft Visual Studio 2008. You will then see another item called Microsoft Visual Studio 2008, and then you will click on that. And then within that Visual Studio environment, you will then be able to specify that you want to work in the Visual Basic environment. We will demonstrate this in another movie. So let's get started.